Okay, welcome back from lunch, everyone. We're going to start off the afternoon with really an update and just diving into some of the details about the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium. I want to just start the afternoon by re-thanking all of our sponsors. We couldn't have made any of this possible without all of you. We have an unprecedented number of sponsors this year, and their logos and their names are all over the room and they're all over the slides. So please say hello, thank them. They're doing so much for our community and for our kids, and we're so grateful because we couldn't do any of this without you. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here, for sticking around and coming back in the room and not going to the pool or the beach. I very much appreciate that because I expected nobody to be sitting here right now. So let's get started. Probably most of you know this. Hold on, someone started my slides for me. Okay, so we're gonna really talk about why the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure matters so much and what it is. So the ABOM is a consortium of a pre-competitive group of stakeholders, and that includes the foundations, so Angelman Syndrome Foundation, FAST, and multiple FAST international organizations. All organizations are invited to participate. In addition to that, there's regulatory involvement. We have Jennifer Panagoulias, the head of regulatory, who's incredibly supportive and helpful, as well as all of the pharmaceutical companies that are developing and working on clinical trials for Angelman syndrome. We have a steering committee, and then we have an entire group of people that come to the scientific meetings that participate. We have clinicians and researchers that really chime in and give us a lot of help and information on how you measure, what to measure, and what is able to be executed upon in a clinical setting. And of course, there are parents who are there who are really guiding what instruments and what measurements are meaningful and important to families living with Angelman syndrome. And so I think it's really important that we highlight for the community what it is, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it. So I'm going to just walk you through a little bit of that. Most of you probably know, but many of you may not. I am the Chief Science Officer for the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. I am the co-director of the ABOM, of the Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium, and my co-patriot is Jennifer Panagoulias, who's over here somewhere in the room as well. And so we really run this initiative together. I'm also the co-director of the International Angelman Syndrome Research Council, for those of you who weren't here this morning. My day job, I'm a veterinarian, so I do interventional radiology and endoscopy. What that really means is probably nothing to you, but I run clinical trials in animals with naturally occurring diseases, so I understand what it takes to run trials and to get therapies to patients. They just happen to walk on 4 legs rather than 2. And my most important job is that I'm the mother of this beautiful little girl. Her name is Quincy, and she is 8 years old, and she lives with Angelman syndrome. So in disclosure, I am the co-founder and former chief operating officer of Genetics Biotherapeutics, and it was recently acquired by Ultragenyx, and now I'm a consultant for Ultragenyx as well. I'm the chief development officer for a company called Mazi Therapeutics, which is developing therapies for non-Angelman related neurodevelopmental disorders, supporting them through the initiatives that FAST has taken and helping other foundations as well to do the things that we were doing. And I'm the consultant to numerous other foundations and initiatives in order to help advance programs similar to what we're doing in Angelman syndrome for other neurodevelopmental disorders. So I talked about this morning, and I'm not going to spend too much time because I think everyone in this room knows the symptoms of Angelman syndrome. But those symptoms really matter when you're trying to figure out what are we going to measure, because what do we want to change? And that's really what this is about, is how do we measure change over time? And how do we measure change before a treatment compared to after a treatment? And is that change not only significant, is it meaningful, and is it measurable? And that's really what Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium is trying to do. And so when we think about the symptoms of AS, we may find some symptoms are really important to us, but other symptoms are important to us, but we can't measure them. So therefore, they're not going to come up as priorities of measurement. We also have to think about the impact that all of this has on families, which should not be understated. And that is really important as we measure quality of life. We need to think about quality of life for patients, but also for caregivers, because we all know that our quality of life can also be impacted by caring for a child with a lot of challenges. And so when we think about what matters, we want to really dive into all the different ways we're trying to correct the underlying cause of Angelman, which we talked about this morning. So as our pillars, we talked about 4 pillars this morning. Our first pillar is replacing mom's gene or mom's protein. The second pillar is activating the silent copy of the gene. The third pillar is downstream targeting, so really focused on therapies. But the fourth pillar is preparing. And the ABOM really fits in the pillar of preparing is how are we going to prepare for human patients to receive therapies? And that's just not getting the drug ready. There's so much more that goes into that. And we've been working really hard to ensure that we're keeping up with our drug development pipeline. And most people are waiting for their drug development pipeline, but we're actually keeping up with it because we've done so well on that front. We need to make sure that we're doing just as well on the endpoint front. So this is really those pillars that we talked about, and moving from discovery to preclinical and now to clinical, and really creating an infrastructure for clinical trials to occur. We need to know what we're measuring in those trials, and that's where we talk about endpoints, outcome measures, and biomarkers. And where is our community and what is our community measuring? So part of that fourth pillar, which I talked a little bit about this morning, and we're going to go into more detail right now as well as throughout the rest of the day. The rest of the day is really focused a bit on these 4 pillars, is that we are developing all the models that we talked about. We do have a group of experts that are advising us on all the things we could be doing for Angelman syndrome. We have a natural history study that has been unbelievably supported by the NIH, by the FDA, and now by the ABOM at Boston Children's Hospital and multiple other sites around the country, Rady's and many others. And they've now enrolled 485 patients over a 15-year period with Angelman syndrome, which is just unbelievable. And we're now running natural history studies thanks to our international partners. FAST UK is running a natural history study, FAST Latin America, Italy is working on one, Spain, and France. So we're really trying to ensure that we understand how do individuals with Angelman syndrome live, how do they function, and how do we measure that function in different countries and different languages. Because if you have an endpoint that's all in English, it may be very hard to utilize that in Spanish if it's not translated and if it's not understood. So we need to make sure that we are really bringing the similar natural history measures to different languages in different countries and different cultures. There's the Global Angelman Syndrome Registry, so we really have to identify who is living with Angelman syndrome around the world, because we need to know where these clinical trials are going to be run and where are these populations. And they've identified, I think it was 1,859 patients or so as of 2 or 3 weeks ago. LADDER, which is the Angelman Syndrome Foundation network that works with DUP15Q as well, linking the DUP15Q and the Angelman syndrome population in the Angelman syndrome clinics around the country. And so those clinics are capturing in hospital, in clinic data, which is incredible amounts of data that can be used in order to understand also the baseline of the disease, whether that's in the natural history study or actually just when you go to these clinics. And so they also have about, I think it's 330 or so Angelman patients enrolled in that as well, which I think is mixed with some of the natural history patients. So there's a lot of really, really great medical data on all of these kiddos. The Global Search and Rescue Initiative, which is really meant to identify the demographics of patients around the world. Where do they live? How old are they? What is their genotype? And really allows us to say we have a deficit of supports and systems set up in maybe Poland, and therefore we need to make sure that there are maybe a certain number of patients, 100, 500 patients in certain countries, and we don't have an infrastructure there. So we want to ensure that we bring infrastructure to those people, and we'll be talking about that later this afternoon. Newborn screening efforts you just heard of, but that's really important because the endpoints and the outcomes that we're going to look at in a newborn are going to be very different than what we might look at in a 21-year-old. But all of it matters and everybody's equally important, and therefore we need to think about our population and finding them from birth all the way until the end of life. And that's very important for us to understand where they are. Really being able to have global centers for trials, training, and innovative therapy is part of bringing therapies to patients and creating that infrastructure in order to be able to do that, which we talked about earlier this morning. And then finally, having a team of people that work together to understand and pick these endpoints that we can all use and support and believe in. So if families don't believe in it and families don't want to perform them, they're not going to have great value. But the regulators actually have to believe in them and support them also for them to have great value. So you have to really look across the spectrum of how can you measure it, what can you measure, what's meaningful and important, and what is going to be accepted as an endpoint for a potential approval. And so being able to work with all of our pharmaceutical colleagues has been really, really incredible. And they've been very, very supportive. I am not the slides are not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the natural history study. So like I said earlier, this team, Ann Wheeler, Anjali Sadhwani, Wenhan Tan, and Lynn Bird, have worked so hard to get this off the ground for the last 15 years. And really in 2016, 17, they just started blowing out publications. And what that did was make us visible in the literature as people that understood the natural history of this disease, which was so important. And the FDA has been so impressed with this unbelievable information. And now we're launching another natural history study because we have new endpoints and new markers that we're trying to evaluate that are more agreeable and more up-to-date for patients with Angelman syndrome in these clinical trials. So it started being funded by the NIH, then it went to the FDA, and now it's being funded by the ABOM, like I said earlier, a collaborative effort between pharmaceutical companies and the foundation. And so this has been really great and a really wonderful collaborative effort. But they have a slew of data and they're looking to enroll more and more patients. And I strongly encourage you to contact the team. They're here. Contact the team and really try to get yourselves enrolled in these natural history studies. Your data is so important for us to be able to understand what Angelman looks like without treatment. Because if we understand that, there is a chance that we'll be able to design clinical trials where we may not need a placebo or a sham if we have robust enough natural history data. That's a wish that we all want, and the regulators go back and forth in giving us feedback whether or not that would ever be acceptable, but that's the dream, is to have this data so that we wouldn't have to think about a control or a placebo in a clinical trial. And so your data really, really matters. And the FDA was here yesterday at the ABOM meeting, and they made that pretty clear that we have incredible natural history data and we should keep collecting it and growing it with the endpoints that we're focused on. The Global Angelman Syndrome Registry, like I said, has 1,859 patients out of 83 countries. And this is data that I think is really impressive, is that they've collected this data from families. So this is very different from Ladder in that Ladder's collecting the data from the clinic and this is collecting the data from parents and from caregivers. But this data is able to be collected yearly and it's able to collect it remotely. And so you can look at the different diagnoses, you can see the different genotypes, you can see the different distribution of ages, you can see the different distribution of regions in which people live, and all of this is very important to say, okay, well, it looks like we have a pretty decent population in Latin America and in Australia. Maybe we want to think about not just running clinical trials in North America, but really jumping into the countries where we have a decent population. And then look at that, we have also a really nice population in Northern Europe and really diving into where we can meet the patients. And that's really important to pharmaceutical companies to be able to see that data. So that's a robust amount of work. What the ABOM is really trying to do is to take different areas of importance to families and to say, this is important to you, this is important to patients, how do we measure that? And how do we measure change over time? And how do we know that that change over time is meaningful and is measurable? And that is really hard. And so we spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to do that, and we really worked together to try to get that done. So let me start with a little history of what the ABOM, where the ABOM started. And so we started this consortium in 2016 as a pre-competitive collaborative spirit in order to do this. And it was FAST and the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and a couple of pharmaceutical companies. It was really pushed by Agilis, who now became PTC, Jody Cook, who was the chief operating officer at Agilis, really helped us and taught us as foundations how we should do this and do it right. And she really guided us where we had no idea what we were doing, on what we needed and who we needed at the table, who were the best stakeholders, and I'll always be so grateful to her for that, because it's really taken off, and it's one of the best things that we have, I think, in the Angelman syndrome community from the pharmaceutical company perspective, and the pharma companies can tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that it's one of the most unique things about our population is that we have so much of this work already done. And we had some researchers and collaborators there as well from UC Davis and University of South Florida, but it was Ovid, Agilis, and then Roche joined a year later in order to kind of kick us off and get us off the ground. We really were focusing on the priorities for industry and doing a gap analysis on endpoints and biomarkers, and then what should we focus on for patients. We had a vision, which was to really start a disease concept model, which is a robust test of interviews of clinicians and parents in order to be able to truly understand, are we aligned on what's meaningful, right? I can tell you that maybe sleep is not as meaningful to my child because she doesn't have a sleep problem. Don't send bullets or a bow and arrow. But she has a lot of other Angelman problems that might be very, very important to my family that might not be important to your family. So you can't just interview one parent and understand what's meaningful, because what's meaningful to them in our heterogeneous population is not necessarily meaningful to another family. So we really needed to figure that out. And so while we were waiting for that to be done, which was a very robust study that was supported by the ABOM and Roche, thank you to Roche for doing that, because that publication has really hit the ground running and has really helped a lot of sponsors do the work that they need to do, certainly at the ABOM. We also ran a parent and caregiver survey, and we just did that on social media because we wanted the data quickly. And doing a true disease concept model actually took 3 years, which is kind of crazy, right? 25 interviews, why does that take 3 years? Well, it is what it is. This is academic publications, but it did. It took 3 years' time. But we did a survey over about 1 month, and in the disease concept model, only 25 caregivers were interviewed, but in the survey that we did, 332 individuals responded to the survey. And those responses really showed the demographics, and it really showed what was meaningful and important, which I'll go into. And then we had a patient-focused listening session with the FDA. So what does that mean? It means that we went to the FDA as a foundation, and we talked to them about the natural history data, what was published. We brought families with us. We brought 5 families, and they got to talk about what was meaningful to them. And we didn't prep them, we didn't tell them what to say, and they sat there and they actually told the FDA what mattered, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we wanted to bring all of our partners to the table at the ABOM in order to really talk about the differences between what they find important and what we find important as families. And so that's very important. And then this group was able to kind of dive into the natural history study that had been collected over the prior 10 years and look into it and say, there are gaps. These are the gaps that need to be filled. This is how the data needs to be collected. We need to improve upon this or upon that, and then be able to change the natural history study, or maybe the way it's being collected or the way it's being published or analyzed, in order for the pharmaceutical companies to have from it what they needed. The EEGs maybe weren't in the right format. We needed to get them all in the right format and things like that. And so that seems kind of esoteric to most of us, but when we talk about the ABOM, it's this black box for many of us, of the parents. This is the work that goes on there that's incredibly important for clinical trials. And so this is really what I'm trying to just share with you. So the disease concept model that ultimately got published in 2020 right here did show the hierarchy of the symptoms that are important based on those 25 interviews, and there were caretaker interviews and then clinician interviews. Communication improvement was number 1. Seizures, disruptive behaviors, and learning challenges. And so that really matched the survey that we did just on Facebook. We did a 332 parent survey on Facebook, which was pretty basic and rudimentary. But what was number 1? Speech. What was number 2? Communication. Our kids and our families want improvement in communication. There's no question about that. And if you talk to any other neurodevelopmental disorder that has a language problem or a speech problem, they want exactly the same thing. It is such an important part of life to communicate with the people around you, to tell people how your day was, what hurts, that you need to go to the potty, whatever it is. It is a necessity to function in life, is to be able to communicate. And I don't know how much clinicians can appreciate that need as much as families can share how we feel about that need. And so that came across loud and clear. Next, seizures, very similar. Then mobility and safety, walking safely, walking and not falling, walking independently. And then life skills, doing things independently. And all of those things really fit, which was very, very important. And so next, we went and brought that all to the FDA. And we said, brought 5 families, went as a nonprofit organization. At the table, not only was members of the FDA, but it was members of almost every division of the FDA. So we had the division of drugs, biologics, orphan, rare, pediatrics. They all came, and they're like, what's this Angelman thing? And really the response we got was, wow. After they met kids and our families, they said, what you read in textbooks is not what I see here today. What I read is very different. And what they appreciated was how capable our kids are, but how they were stuck. And it was so obvious to them. I don't believe that by the book, they thought there was capability. And what they saw was huge capability. And so as we were there, they basically wrote an endpoint for us and said, you need to do a communication endpoint that is specific to Angelman syndrome, because there's no endpoints out there that are going to capture your kids. Your kids are going to fall below the floor on these endpoints, meaning that they're going to have so much to learn to get to measurable that we're going to lose any gains because the tests we have are not capturing their gains. So therefore, you need to discover something that meets your kids where they are, but doesn't allow them to go to the floor or to the ceiling. And that was feedback directly from the FDA. And we took that feedback and we ran with it. And so really, we talked a lot with them about communication and many other endpoints, but really that was the focus for them, because every parent in the room said, what matters to me is communication. And so we talked about what was out there currently, which was the communication matrix. And the communication matrix is excellent. And it's really out there to measure speech function in kids with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities, but it is not meant to be an endpoint for clinical trials. And how it's designed and how it was made was for speech therapists to look at progress over time with children. But it actually has a lot of flaws when it comes to the way it can be used in clinical trials, because it wasn't designed for that. The measure is not flawed at all. It wasn't a measure designed for clinical trials. So the FDA wasn't really fond of it because of that. It wasn't really designed the right way. We'd have to go back to the drawing board and create it in a way that was validated and appropriate for the FDA. And so we really had to think about, how are we going to measure this in our kids? And so the advice they gave us was develop a simplistic communication tool to capture basic but important changes in communication for a child with AS. We want the ability to clearly communicate basic personal needs, hunger, by any modality, gesture, sign, AAC, sound, intimation, whatever it is. But if they can communicate something more today than they could yesterday, that is a meaningful change, and we need to be able to measure that. And that was a very clear message that we needed to move forward on something that was for Angelman syndrome. And that could eventually maybe be applied for many other neurodevelopmental disorders, but of course, as always, our focus is Angelman syndrome. And we do want to help others eventually, but we want to help Angelman first. And so what we were able to do was we were introduced to a team at Duke University, who you're going to hear from later today, so I'm not going to share any of the data, but what I just want to show you is we talked about the floor effect, where our kids are so far below the floor we can't measure them. Well, look at this when your kids are actually measured and they're on the middle of the bell curve. That's a good measure. If your kids are not on the floor and they're not on the ceiling, but they're right in the middle. And we can measure that, and then we can measure change. And so we were able to work with the team at Duke, and we were able to develop this measure for Angelman syndrome. And since that time, Duke actually received a grant for over $2 million in collaboration with Combined Brain by the FDA to develop this measure for other endpoints of Angelman syndrome, for other neurodevelopmental disorders that are not Angelman syndrome, 14 other disorders. So now for Angelman, we created something that other people can benefit from, which is really what we need to do as we pay things forward. And so in 2022, which was yesterday, we have a steering committee of 42 members, including 4 foundations, academic KOLs, and 13 industry partners. It is a pre-competitive consortium that has no CDA or NDA. we are making incredible progress because we don't have a CDA or an NDA. And that maybe seems strange. But what we found was that if we pay for everything and we share everything, a lot gets done. But when they pay for things, unfortunately, not everybody's always willing to share. And so we decided as an organization that we were going to invest $1 million a year, if we needed to, up to $1 million, to support developing endpoints for Angelman syndrome. And we decided that 2 years ago. And we have done that, and we have made huge strides. And I think yesterday was a really good example of all of the talks and how far we've come on all of the endpoints we've been developing for AS. So that's been really important. We had 3 pharmaceutical companies there in 2016, 5 in 2018, and we had 13 members of the steering committee in 2022, with over 24 pharmaceutical companies actually interested in listening, but not necessarily as part of the steering committee. We have quarterly meetings with all of the members of the steering committee where we talk about these complicated issues. And ultimately, we had 325 people attend the conference yesterday, listening to endpoints and biomarkers and chiming in on what's important and what's meaningful. And most exciting was that for the first time, we had the FDA sitting in the audience, and they were participating, and they were listening, and they were giving us advice about what we should do. And they were very supportive of us as a pre-competitive group trying to use endpoints that are agreeable amongst all of the companies and amongst the organizations. So it was really, really exciting. And that is, that was last year, but that's basically what the room looks like, and that's why it's a closed room session where we're really, really diving into the clinical and the research parts of this. And so when industry is asked what functional domains are important to them, you can see that these high, medium areas are communication, biomarkers, global measures, and gross and fine motor. When we talked about what's important to families, families are in red and industry is in blue. It doesn't always totally align. Why is that? Because families don't know what's measurable. They just know what's meaningful. But industry knows what's measurable, and they're listening to us on what's meaningful. And then you find common ground. And that's really what it's all about, is finding common ground and parents and caregivers having a voice so that it's very clear what's meaningful. And so we really focus on communication and speech, seizures, gross and fine motor skills, cognition, and activities of daily living, daily life skills, and then trying to figure out what endpoints are best for those skills. And so then we also look at global. How do we look at these patients globally, right? How do we just say, are they better or are they worse? How severe are they today? How severe are they tomorrow? And can we look at these global scales, since it's such a heterogeneous disease, and not just focus on one thing like communication, but can we focus on everything? Can we kind of put this into more of a composite of just global change? And so this is something called a CGI, which is a clinician or a caregiver global impression change scale. And this is something that all the companies have been working very hard on, starting with Ovid in 2016, and then every company has kind of developed their own flavor of this type of endpoint. And really it's a 7-point scale generally. This is just one example where you can see this is the data from Ultragenyx, and I'm only showing this baseline data because this is the only one that's published actually in the literature. But what you can see here is that the severity of 5 individual patients in all of the different domains, you can see that in terms of severity, most kids with Angelman are moderately to severely impacted in the domains of sleep, behavior, communication, gross motor, fine motor, global. So if we can measure that severity, can we measure that severity change over time? So you can look at how severe it is, and then you could say, is it slightly improved, very much improved, or are we slightly worse or very much worse over time? So you can see some things might go up in a trial and some things might go down. And then overall, how is that patient functioning? And then the clinician can rate that, and then the parents can rate that on a parent scale. And so these are just scales that have to be developed. Looking at motor function in a real-world setting is also important. So how do our kids function motorically? Really being able to show what they look like. So this is my daughter on the left, Quincy, who is obviously an early walker here. She's learning how to step over. We're showing ataxia. We're showing that it's really, really hard for her. And she's doing all of these new types of skills. and there she falls, right? So this is important for us, and then she's a happy little nugget. But this is important for us to show pharmaceutical companies and regulators, where are we starting? Can we develop video endpoints to say if she's doing this now and she looks much better later, is that enough to show change? Because she may not do it in a clinical setting, she has dyspraxia, right? All of our kids do, but she might do it at home. Will a video assess that? Or so we had someone talking yesterday about Angelman Syndrome video assessments that's been sponsored by Ionis and working with Boston Children's Hospital, which is a really great way. And here's another little nugget, just because I thought you should see this beauty. Oh, where'd she go? Oh, the video's not working, I apologize. But that, very, very similar, that classic Angelman gait. Can we look at this before, and then can we look at this after? So another way that we can measure this in a real world setting is to put little sensors on their ankles. And if we can watch her walk, and she's always the one that's willing to test out the devices. So there she's walking, and what you can see on this video here is that as she's walking, they're capturing her gait as it moves, and then they can capture falls. And what you can see here is this is what can be captured, and it's objective data of how her gait is, how she walks, how she falls, and then you can measure over time neurotypical compared to Angelman, and you can see that Angelman is very different than neurotypical. And if these gait parameters that we can determine are meaningful change more toward neurotypical, is that an objective measure with a video that shows she's walking better to say that this drug is or isn't working? And so that's really, really important. And then we have biomarkers. Biomarkers like measuring CSF and measuring UBE3A maybe in the CSF. So we had some talks yesterday about how you can measure proteins and measure changes in the CSF over time. What does Angelman look like compared to others? And so that's really, really important to say a drug might be working. And another good biomarker is EEG. So our kids have very, very abnormal EEGs, and if we can measure the abnormality on that EEG and watch it change over time, that is an objective measure that would be considered a biomarker. And so these are just different examples of biomarkers. So overall, as we move along of what's meaningful, what is measurable, and what is focused, and what is priorities, we've narrowed it down to using these tools to measure the domains of Angelman syndrome. So that's what the ABOM does. And that's what we're here for. And so really quickly, without appropriate endpoints that are both sensitive and meaningful to you, large-scale progress just can't be made. Meaningful to patients and families is what's most important, and that doesn't always align what's meaningful to regulators or payers, like the insurance companies. So we need to really work now to figure that out and how we close that gap. We close it with your help. Participate in studies. The natural history study, the team is here, meet them, go join the natural history study. The gait analysis study, they're outside, do an interview, it's 30 minutes of your time. It's gonna help get some of these devices to learn meaningfulness of gait, meaningfulness of walking, falling, how your gait is. Quality of life survey, they're here, meet with them, talk about quality of life. There's some questionnaires they want you to do to really understand what the questions in these surveys mean and what do they mean to you. And then meaningfulness of change. So Dr. Sadhwani presented yesterday about a great change study looking at what changes can be seen and how meaningful that is. And that team is here as well. And I want to thank our community who has done so much work to help that study. They have committed so much time to be able to support that work. And then join focus groups, join advisory boards when they're called for so that people can hear your voice and hear what's meaningful to you. So this is the cisnav study out there. You can hit the QR code or just go outside and sign up for an interview. This is RTI, you can hit this QR code and do the caregiver report. But what's really important is that you realize how hard we're working, all of us, pharma, clinicians, researchers, every foundation. We're all here working together to make a difference in every child's life, but we need to know what matters to you. And so you have to participate and get this information to them so that we can figure out what the best measures are in these trials. Because approvals are what we need for it to get to everybody.